June 4, 1943. The North African desert stretched endlessly under the blistering sun. Inside the makeshift maintenance depot near Bizerte, Tunisia, Staff Sergeant Montgomery Falsworth stood frozen, staring at the Sherman tank before him. What had begun as a routine repainting job had just turned into something entirely different. The viscous mixture dripped slowly from his brush, forming an unusual pattern on the olive drab surface, thicker, more textured than standard issue. Around him, the sounds of the maintenance yard continued, engines revving, metal clanking against metal, men shouting orders, but Falsworth noticed none of it. His eyes were fixed on the peculiar way the experimental paint compound had reacted to the scorching metal surface of the tank. "Sergeant Falsworth, what in God's name is that mess?" Captain Jernigan's voice cut through the humid air. "That's not regulation. Strip it off and start again." Falsworth turned slowly, his face streaked with sweat and grime. "Sir, I believe there's something unusual happening with this mixture. The chemical reaction with the metal. I don't care if it turns the tank invisible, soldier. That's not the approved formula. We follow orders here." The captain's face was red with frustration. "This isn't your university laboratory." Falsworth nodded reluctantly. "Yes, sir. I'll remove it immediately." But he didn't. And that decision, that single moment of quiet defiance on a sweltering North African afternoon, would alter the course of American tank warfare in the European theater. No one in the 4th Armored Division knew that one man's chemical accident and subsequent insubordination would save hundreds of tanks and thousands of lives in the battles to come. Montgomery Falsworth hadn't planned on becoming a soldier, much less one who would defy direct orders. Born in 1915 to a modest family in Kalamazoo, Michigan, he was the son of a hardware store owner who believed in honest work and practical knowledge. Young Montgomery displayed an uncanny talent for chemistry from an early age, mixing household substances in his father's shed until one particularly ambitious experiment at age 12 left the small wooden structure with a hole in its roof. Rather than punish the boy, his father recognized the spark of genius and encouraged it, scraping together enough money to buy him proper chemistry equipment for Christmas that year. In high school, Falsworth excelled in science and mathematics, earning a partial scholarship to the University of Michigan. There he specialized in polymer chemistry, graduating with honors in 1937. His professors noted his particular gift for practical applications rather than theoretical work. "Falsworth can make chemicals do things they aren't supposed to do," Shanley, one recommendation letter, stated. "He thinks with his hands as much as his mind." After graduation, he took a job with Industrial Coatings of America, a mid-sized company that manufactured protective paints for machinery and industrial equipment. There, Falsworth developed several innovative formulas, including a heat-resistant coating for factory equipment that earned him a modest promotion. His life seemed set on a predictable path of quiet innovation in civilian industry. Then Pearl Harbor changed everything. When America entered World War II, Falsworth, like thousands of other young men, enlisted immediately. Given his background in chemistry, he expected to be assigned to a research division or perhaps a munitions factory. Instead, the Army, desperately building its ranks, assigned him to the 4th Armored Division as a regular soldier. During basic training, his commanding officers quickly recognized that Falsworth's slight build and thoughtful demeanor made him ill-suited for frontline combat. However, when a routine questionnaire revealed his expertise in protective coatings, he was reassigned to maintenance, specifically to tank preparation and painting. Most of his fellow soldiers viewed painting detail as mind-numbing work, but Falsworth approached it with scientific curiosity. He began studying the vulnerabilities of American tanks, particularly the M4 Sherman, and wondered if improved coatings might address some of these weaknesses. His suggestions to superior officers were typically met with indifference or irritation. "We don't need scientists here, Falsworth. "We need soldiers who follow orders," his platoon sergeant told him, after one particularly detailed proposal about improving the heat-resistant qualities of tank paint. "The formulas come from the top. Your job is to apply them, not improve them." Falsworth learned to keep his observations to himself, but he never stopped analyzing. He had no idea that soon those analytical instincts would be all that stood between hundreds of American tanks and their destruction. By early 1943, the North African campaign was reaching its conclusion. The Allied forces had pushed the Germans and Italians into Tunisia, where they would make their final stand on the continent. For the American forces, including the 4th Armored Division, this campaign had been a harsh education. The desert environment had revealed critical weaknesses in American equipment, particularly the M4 Sherman tanks. The Sherman had many advantages. It was reliable, relatively easy to maintain, and could be produced in large numbers. But it had a fatal flaw that German gunners had learned to exploit. The Sherman's armor was vulnerable to German 88mm guns, and worse, the tanks had an alarming tendency to catch fire when hit. American tank crews grimly referred to them as Ronson lighters or Tommy cookers, after the popular cigarette lighter advertised with the slogan, "Lights first time, every time." The technical reality behind this nickname was sobering. When a German shell penetrated a Sherman's armor, it often ignited the ammunition stored inside, creating a catastrophic fire that gave the crew mere seconds to escape. Analysis of tank losses in North Africa showed that a Sherman hit by enemy fire had an 80% chance of catching fire. Crews began to store extra ammunition outside the tank, in containers welded to the exterior, a dangerous but potentially life-saving compromise. The High Command was well aware of these issues. Engineering teams back in the United States were working on improved designs, but manufacturing and shipping new tanks or retrofitting existing ones would take months. In the meantime, American tanks would continue to burn, and American soldiers would continue to face extreme danger. It was against this backdrop that the 4th Armored Division received orders to prepare for redeployment to Sicily, following the successful conclusion of operations in North Africa. Part of this preparation involved repainting their vehicles, many of which had been damaged by the harsh desert conditions. Standard procedure called for olive drab paint mixed with a precise ratio of heat-resistant additives, a formula developed by chemical engineers in stateside laboratories and rigidly adhered to by quartermasters in the field. Falsworth had been assigned to the painting detail, working with a team of 8 other men to repaint 37 tanks in 5 days. It was exhausting work under the North African sun, but Falsworth approached it with his usual methodical attention. On the 3rd day, a supply clerk delivered several drums of paint components that looked different from the usual shipment. "These just arrived from Alexandria," the clerk explained. "They said to use these instead of the standard mix. Apparently, the regular stuff got diverted to another unit." Falsworth examined the new barrels. They contained base paint similar to their usual supply, but the additives were different, manufactured by a British company he wasn't familiar with. The accompanying instructions indicated a different mixing ratio than what they typically used. "Has this been approved?" Falsworth asked. The clerk shrugged. "Orders say to use what you've got. Command just wants these tanks ready to roll by Friday." Following protocol, Falsworth reported the substitution to Lieutenant Drummond, who merely glanced at the paperwork. "If quartermaster sent it, use it," he said dismissively. "Just get those tanks painted." Falsworth nodded and returned to his team, instructing them on the new mixing ratio. But something bothered him about the new compounds. One particular additive, a viscous amber-colored substance labeled Thermal Barrier Compound B, had an unusual smell and consistency unlike anything in their regular supplies. When mixed according to the provided instructions, the resulting paint seemed thinner than normal. Falsworth decided to test the mixture on a small patch of a tank before proceeding with full application. It was during this test that he noticed something unusual. When applied to the hot metal surface of a tank that had been sitting in the sun, the paint mixture underwent a visible chemical reaction, thickening and creating a textured surface with an almost ceramic-like quality. Intrigued, Falsworth scraped off a small sample of the dried test patch and examined it closely. The texture reminded him of a heat-dissipating compound he had worked with at Industrial Coatings. On impulse, he held a lighter near the sample and observed that it dissipated heat remarkably well, much better than the standard paint formula. That evening, after most of the maintenance crew had retired to their tents, Falsworth remained in the makeshift lab area, conducting impromptu experiments with the new paint mixture. By varying the ratios of the components, he discovered that increasing the proportion of the British additive produced an even stronger heat-resistant effect, but the resulting mixture was thicker and more textured than regulation allowed. It would never pass inspection. Falsworth spent a restless night considering the implications. The Sherman's vulnerability to fire was largely due to heat transfer. When an enemy shell struck the armor, the intense heat often ignited fuel and ammunition inside. If this new paint compound could better dissipate that heat, it might reduce the likelihood of catastrophic fires. The next morning, Falsworth approached Lieutenant Drummond with his findings, attempting to explain the potential benefits of modifying the paint formula. "Sir, I believe this British compound might improve the tank's heat resistance. If we adjust the ratio—" "Falsworth," the lieutenant cut him off, "we don't have time for your science projects. Follow the mixing instructions as provided. That's an order." "But, sir, this could potentially save lives. The thermal properties—" "Enough." Drummond's patience had evaporated in the desert heat. "You're a painter, not an engineer. Stick to your assignment, or I'll have you digging latrines for the rest of the campaign." Falsworth returned to his workstation, outwardly complying but inwardly resolute. The paint crew had 21 more tanks to complete in 2 days. As team supervisor, Falsworth controlled the final mixing of the paint compounds before distribution to his painters. He made his decision. The tanks of Baker Company, 4th Armored Division, he would receive a special coating, one that violated direct orders but might just save lives in the battles to come. Falsworth altered the mixing formula, doubling the proportion of the British thermal compound and adding a binding agent from their regular supplies to improve adhesion. The resulting mixture was thicker with a subtly textured appearance when dry, but not so different that casual inspection would reveal the deviation. He instructed his team to apply the modified paint to the remaining tanks, telling them only that he'd adjusted the formula for better coverage in desert conditions. Most of the men, exhausted from working in the 100-degree heat, asked no questions. The few who noticed the different consistency were told it was due to the British components, which was technically true. They completed the painting assignment on schedule. During final inspection, Captain Jernigan noted the slightly different appearance of the Baker Company tanks, but attributed it to the substitute components. The tanks were declared ready for transport to Sicily, and Falsworth's unauthorized experiment rolled forward with them. What Falsworth couldn't know was that his modified tanks were about to face one of the most intense armored engagements of the Sicilian campaign, and that his paint formula would undergo a trial by fire more literal than he could have imagined. July 10, 1943, the invasion of Sicily, codenamed Operation Husky, had begun. American and British forces landed on the southern coast of the island, with the 4th Armored Division coming ashore near Gela. Their objective was to push inland, secure key roadways, and eventually link up with British forces advancing from the east. The Italian defenders offered relatively light resistance, but German forces on the island, particularly the formidable Hermann Göring Panzer Division, prepared to counterattack with their superior Tiger tanks. The stage was set for a confrontation that would put American armor and Falsworth's modified paint to the test. Falsworth, now promoted to technical sergeant based on his efficiency during the North African campaign, landed with the maintenance units 2 days after the initial invasion. His role was to establish a forward repair depot to keep the division's vehicles operational. From this position, he would soon hear reports from the front that would validate his unauthorized experiment in ways he never expected. The engagement began on July 11th when elements of the 4th Armored Division encountered German armor near the town of Nissimi. The Americans had 53 Sherman tanks spread across 3 companies, Alpha, Baker, and Charlie. Baker Company's tanks were those that Falsworth had painted with his modified formula. The other 2 companies had received the standard paint application. The battle commenced at dawn, with German 88mm guns opening fire from concealed positions in the rocky Sicilian landscape. Within the first 30 minutes, the American force lost 7 tanks, 5 from Alpha Company and 2 from Charlie. Each tank brewed up in the familiar pattern: penetration, immediate fire, catastrophic loss. None of Baker Company's tanks had yet been hit. Staff Sergeant Remington Holt, commanding a Baker Company Sherman, would later describe what happened next in a field report. "We were advancing toward a ridgeline when I saw Donovan's tank to my left take a direct hit from what must have been an 88. I expected the usual, the flames, and then the crew bailing if they were lucky. But something different happened. The shell penetrated all right. You could see that from the impact point, but there was no immediate fire. Donovan and his crew had time to abandon ship in an orderly way before the tank eventually caught fire, and that fire burned slower, less intense than what I've seen before. It was the damnedest thing." Similar reports came in throughout the day. Baker Company lost 8 tanks during the engagement, a significant loss, but with a crucial difference. Of those 8, 6 were successfully evacuated by their entire crews with no casualties. The tank still eventually caught fire, but the delay between impact and ignition averaged 72 seconds compared to the typical 7 to 10 seconds with a standard Sherman. This critical minute of extra time allowed crews to escape. In stark contrast, Alpha Company lost 14 tanks, with 23 crewmen killed and 17 wounded. Charlie Company fared slightly better, losing 11 tanks with 17 fatalities and 13 wounded. Baker Company's final casualty count: 3 killed, 9 wounded. The numbers revealed a truth no orders could hide. Something was different about the Baker Company tanks, and word began to spread among the tank crews. By July 15th, rumors were circulating throughout the 4th Armored Division. Tank commanders were requesting transfers to Baker Company. Maintenance crews were examining the Baker tanks, trying to identify what made them different. Falsworth, hearing these reports, maintained a careful silence, continuing his assigned duties while observing the unfolding situation with a mixture of validation and apprehension. He had violated orders, and the evidence of that violation was becoming increasingly apparent. It wasn't until July 20th that Falsworth was summoned to division headquarters. He arrived expecting disciplinary action, perhaps even a court-martial. Instead, he found himself facing Colonel Ravenswood, the division's technical operations officer, along with 2 civilian men in rumpled suits who were introduced as representatives from Army Ordnance. "Sergeant Falsworth," Colonel Ravenswood began, without preamble, "we've been analyzing combat data from the past 10 days. Baker Company tanks are showing an 83% crew survival rate when hit by enemy fire, compared to 41% in other companies. The only significant difference we can identify is the exterior paint application. Would you care to explain that?" The moment of truth had arrived. Falsworth stood at attention, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Sir, while preparing tanks for deployment from North Africa, I modified the paint formula using the British thermal compound we received. I increased the concentration to improve heat dissipation properties and added a binding agent to maintain adhesion. I believed this might reduce the rate of catastrophic fires when our tanks were hit. And you implemented this modification without authorization. one of the civilians asked, his tone more curious than accusatory. Yes, sir. My request to test the modification was denied by Lieutenant Drummond. I made the decision to proceed anyway, believing the potential to save lives outweighed the breach of protocol. Colonel Ravenswood leaned forward, his expression unreadable. You do understand the seriousness of violating direct orders in a combat zone? I do, sir, Falsworth replied, bracing for the consequences. What happened next would change the course of American tank warfare for the remainder of the European campaign. Gentlemen, Colonel Ravenswood addressed the civilians, I believe we've found our man. Then, turning back to Falsworth, Sergeant, effective immediately, you're being reassigned to a special technical unit under my command. We need you to document your formula in detail and supervise its application to every tank in this division. After that, we'll be establishing what we're calling the Battlefield Adaptations Laboratory. Hoik, your chemical accident may have just saved more American lives than any single action since this war began. The civilians, who Falsworth would later learn were chemical engineers from Aberdeen Proving Ground, peppered him with technical questions for the next 2 hours. How exactly had he mixed the compounds? What was the precise ratio? Had he noticed any degradation in the coating after exposure to combat conditions? Falsworth answered each question methodically, drawing diagrams and chemical equations on a chalkboard that had been quickly set up for him. By the end of July, Falsworth's modified formula, now officially designated Thermal Dissipative Coating XM7, was being applied to every Sherman tank in Sicily. A detailed report of its effectiveness, along with the precise formula, was dispatched to the United States, where production of the new coating began immediately. But the story doesn't end there. The improvised paint formula was just the beginning of Falsworth's contribution to the war effort. The newly established Battlefield Adaptations Laboratory, operating from a converted Italian villa near Syracuse, became a hub of practical innovation. Falsworth, promoted to warrant officer and given a team of 8 technicians, was tasked with solving a variety of field problems that regular engineering units weren't addressing. Under Falsworth's leadership, the lab developed several additional innovations: a modified track design that reduced throwing tracks on rocky terrain, an improved air filtration system that extended engine life in dusty conditions, and a reconfigured ammunition storage protocol that further reduced fire risk. Each innovation was tested under combat conditions, refined based on feedback from tank crews, and then implemented across the division. By the time the 4th Armored Division moved to mainland Italy in September 1943, their tank casualty rate had decreased by 62% compared to other American armored units. More importantly, crew survival rates when tanks were hit had increased to 78%, an unprecedented improvement that saved hundreds of lives. Word of the battlefield miracles, DIS as some called them, spread to other American divisions. By November, technical representatives from the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Armored Divisions had visited Falsworth's lab to learn his methods. The improvisations born in the North African desert and refined in the Sicilian campaign were spreading throughout the American armored forces in Europe. In December 1943, Falsworth received orders to return to the United States. He was being assigned to Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, where he would help establish a larger version of his Battlefield Adaptations program. Before leaving Sicily, he trained his replacement, Lieutenant Garrison Mercer, an engineering officer who had shown particular aptitude for practical innovation. Remember, Falsworth told Mercer during their final meeting, "The enemy doesn't care about our technical specifications or our approved procedures. They only care about finding our weaknesses. Our job is to eliminate those weaknesses faster than they can exploit them." Mercer nodded solemnly. "Even if that means bending the rules?" Falsworth smiled for the first time in days. Especially then. Back in the United States, Falsworth found himself in an expanded version of the impromptu lab he'd created in Sicily, At Aberdeen, he was given proper facilities, a staff of 27 engineers and technicians, and access to actual test ranges where innovations could be properly evaluated before field deployment. The thermal dissipative coating had by then been further refined and was being applied to every new Sherman tank produced. Engineers had analyzed Fallsworth's formula and made minor improvements to its durability and weather resistance, but the core innovation, the increased concentration of the British thermal compound, remained unchanged. Fallsworth worked at Aberdeen for 4 months, helping to systematize the process of battlefield innovation and establish channels for combat units to report problems and suggest solutions. But he grew restless in the sterile environment of the stateside facility. The immediacy of the battlefield, the direct connection to the men whose lives hung in the balance, these were missing from the bureaucratic structure of Aberdeen. In April 1944, Fallsworth requested reassignment to the European theater. His request was initially denied, with his superiors insisting his expertise was too valuable to risk in a combat zone. Fallsworth persisted, arguing that the most effective innovations came from direct observation of combat conditions. After his third request, accompanied by a detailed proposal for a mobile adaptation unit that would follow closely behind frontline armored divisions, permission was finally granted. In June 1944, just days after the D-Day landings, Warrant Officer Montgomery Fallsworth returned to Europe, landing on Utah Beach with a specialized team of 5 engineers and technicians. Their equipment included a modified M3 half-track that had been converted into a mobile laboratory with basic chemical testing equipment, a small machine shop, and documentation facilities. This mobile adaptation unit, as it was officially designated, was assigned to support the 4th Armored Division, which would soon become the spearhead of General Patton's Third Army in the breakout from Normandy. Fallsworth's team would observe tanks in combat, identify vulnerabilities, and develop field modifications that could be implemented immediately. The unit quickly proved its worth during the Normandy campaign. When the dense hedgerows of the Norman countryside proved difficult for tanks to penetrate, Fallsworth's team helped refine and implement the Rhino device. Salvaged German beach obstacles welded to the front of Sherman tanks that allowed them to push through the hedgerows instead of climbing over them. This modification, combined with improved tactics, significantly reduced the vulnerability of American tanks during the critical breakout operations. As the Allied forces pushed eastward across France, Fallsworth's mobile adaptation unit continued to develop solutions to emerging problems. They created improved waterproofing methods for deep water fording, enhanced the reliability of tank radios in combat conditions, and developed a quick-release mechanism for jammed turrets. But it was during the Battle of Aricourt in September 1944 that Fallsworth's original paint innovation would prove its ultimate value. In what would become one of the largest tank battles on the Western Front, the 4th Armored Division engaged elements of the German 5th Panzer Army near the town of Aricourt in Lorraine. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, the Americans fielded primarily Shermans against the superior German Panther tanks. The 4th Armored achieved a remarkable victory. Over 4 days of intense fighting, they destroyed 86 German tanks while losing only 25 of their own. More significantly, the crew survival rate for hit American tanks was 87%, compared to 34% for the Germans. In the after-action analysis, multiple factors were credited for this success: superior tactics, better coordination with artillery and air support, and the numerous technical innovations that had been implemented since Sicily, chief among them the thermal dissipative coating that had begun with Fallsworth's unauthorized experiment 15 months earlier. A German officer captured during the battle, Hauptmann Dieter Kessler, provided perhaps the most telling assessment. During his interrogation, he expressed surprise at the resilience of the American tanks. "We hit them, we see the penetration, but they don't burn like they used to," he stated in his debriefing. It gives their crews time to escape, time to fight back. It is most concerning. What Hauptmann Kessler couldn't know was that the coating now protecting American tanks had begun as an act of insubordination by a chemist-turned-soldier who had valued lives over regulations. By the war's end, Fallsworth's thermal dissipative coating had been applied to more than 11,000 Sherman tanks across all theaters of operation. Conservative estimates by the Army Ballistics Research Laboratory indicated that the coating had saved the lives of approximately 8,000 tank crewmen who would have otherwise perished in the immediate fires that typically followed a tank being hit. The mobile adaptation program that grew from Fallsworth's initial experiment eventually expanded to 16 units operating throughout Europe and the Pacific, each developing specialized solutions for their respective theaters. These units are credited with numerous innovations that improved vehicle performance, crew survival, and combat effectiveness. Montgomery Fallsworth remained with the 4th Armored Division until Victory in Europe Day, continuing to refine his methods and train new generations of adaptation specialists. He was awarded the Legion of Merit for his contributions to the war effort, though the citation carefully avoided mentioning that his most significant innovation began as an act of disobedience. After the war, Fallsworth returned to Industrial Coatings of America, where he was appointed Director of Research and Development. The company soon secured several government contracts to develop protective coatings for military and civilian applications, many building upon the principles Fallsworth had discovered during his wartime improvisation. In 1954, Fallsworth was invited to lecture at the newly established Armor School at Fort Knox, where the story of his paint innovation had become part of the curriculum, though notably the official version glossed over the unauthorized nature of the original experiment, describing it instead as a field-initiated adaptive response to combat conditions. Fallsworth was more forthright when speaking privately with officer candidates. Sometimes, he told one group during an informal gathering after his lecture, the most important orders are the ones you choose not to follow. But, he added with characteristic caution, you'd better be right. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, the principles established by Fallsworth's Battlefield Adaptations Program influenced American military doctrine, contributing to the concept of adaptive engineering that would become central to equipment development during the Cold War. The idea that frontline problems required frontline solutions rather than waiting for perfect answers from distant laboratories became embedded in American military thinking. Fallsworth retired from industrial coatings in 1972, settling in Ann Arbor, Michigan, not far from the university where he had studied chemistry decades earlier. He occasionally gave guest lectures at the engineering school, but generally avoided publicity. When approached by military historians interested in his wartime innovations, he typically downplayed his personal role, emphasizing instead the collaborative nature of the adaptation program and the courage of the tank crews who tested his solutions in combat. In 1981, nearly 4 decades after his unauthorized experiment in North Africa, Fallsworth received a letter from a former tank commander named Sergeant Harrington Mercer, who had served with Baker Company of the 4th Armored Division. Mercer had been among those who escaped a hit tank during the battle near Nesemi in July 1943. "I've carried something all these years," Mercer wrote, "a question about why I survived when so many others didn't. Recently, I found an article mentioning your work with tank paint. It described how Baker Company tanks gave crews more time to escape when hit. That was my company. That was my tank. I've lived 40 more years because of what you did. Married my sweetheart, raised a family, built a good life. I never knew who to thank for that extra minute until now." Fallsworth kept the letter in his desk drawer and would occasionally reread it in his final years. Montgomery Fallsworth passed away peacefully in his sleep on October 12, 1984, at the age of 69. His obituary in the Ann Arbor News mentioned his wartime service and his contributions to industrial chemistry, but not the specific story of the paint innovation that had saved thousands of lives. That story, though documented in military archives and technical manuals, remained relatively obscure to the general public. In 2003, during a major renovation of the Patton Museum at Fort Knox, researchers uncovered Fallsworth's original handwritten notes on the thermal dissipative coating formula, preserved in the museum's archives. This discovery sparked renewed interest in his story, resulting in a special exhibition titled Battlefield Innovation: The Fallsworth Legacy. The exhibition featured a restored Sherman tank painted with a recreation of Fallsworth's original formula, alongside displays detailing how a single, unauthorized experiment had cascaded into a program that saved thousands of lives and transformed American military thinking about innovation. Perhaps the most powerful artifact in the exhibition was a simple chart comparing casualty rates before and after the implementation of Fallsworth's coating. Two lines tracked across Europe from 1943 to 1945, one showing the steadily declining rate of fatalities when tanks were hit, the other showing the steadily rising rate of crew survival. The diverging lines told a story more eloquent than any narrative could convey. Each widening increment represented human beings who returned home because one man had chosen to disobey a direct order. The exhibition included a quote from Fallsworth's last interview given to a military historian just months before his death. "I've often wondered what would have happened if I'd followed orders that day. It's a strange thing to realize that my greatest contribution came from an act of disobedience, but I've never regretted it, not for a moment." Today, the principles of battlefield adaptation that began with Fallsworth's improvised paint formula are standard practice in modern military operations. Combat units around the world maintain technical specialists whose job is to identify problems and develop immediate solutions, rather than waiting for perfect answers from distant research facilities. The divide between theory and practice, between laboratory and battlefield, has narrowed considerably since Fallsworth's day. Modern tank designs incorporate many lessons learned from those desperate days when American tanks burned too easily and crews faced unnecessary danger. Advanced materials, compartmentalized ammunition storage, automatic fire suppression systems, all can trace their conceptual lineage back to the problems Fallsworth and his contemporaries struggled to solve. But perhaps the most enduring legacy is not technological, but philosophical. The recognition that innovation often comes from unexpected sources, that battlefield necessity sometimes trumps organizational hierarchy, and that one person's decision to trust their expertise over protocol can sometimes change the course of history. In the final analysis, Montgomery Fallsworth's story is not just about paint or chemistry or even warfare. It's about the moral courage to act on conviction when lives are at stake. It's about the tension between discipline and innovation, between following orders and following conscience. It's about the cascading consequences of small decisions made in obscure corners of vast conflicts. Would you have broken the order or obeyed it? Would you have trusted your expertise over established protocol, risking court-martial to save lives that might never be counted? Would you have had the courage to paint a tank differently, knowing that seemingly insignificant choice might change the course of battle? These questions remain relevant long after the tanks of World War II have fallen silent. In emergency rooms, in corporate boardrooms, in engineering teams, and on modern battlefields, individuals still face moments when protocol and necessity diverge. The paint may change, but the dilemma remains the same. Montgomery Fallsworth's unauthorized experiment saved approximately 8,000 lives by the most conservative estimates. Those 8,000 men returned home, built futures, created innovations, and contributed to society in countless ways that continue to ripple through time. An entire legacy exists because one chemist trusted his training over his orders. Sometimes, the most profound acts of heroism leave no visible monument, just the quiet evidence of lives not ended, futures not extinguished, potential not lost. The most powerful legacy is often the one we cannot see, the future that might have been denied but was instead permitted to unfold. Comment below and share the story so others remember what courage really means. The courage to defy convention when lives hang in the balance, to trust expertise over authority when the moment demands it, and to accept responsibility for the consequences, whatever they may be.